Hello, Telvani here, and today GGG released the 3.18 patch notes. It was tempting to try and release this guide earlier in the hype train for Sentinel League, like several other content creators have done with their League starters. However, I decided to do so would be irresponsible, as without patch notes, we don't know with certainty whether a build will survive or not. And I would hate for someone to have a horrible League start because they started on a bricked build they watched from before the patch notes were released. Now that we know with 100% certainty that GGG is not making any balance changes, and can clearly see that Nightblade support has remained untouched, I am happy to share with you my League starter, Spectral Helix Raider. Alright, so let's get into it. Why Spectral Helix? Spectral Helix is an excellent League start skill. It is one of the highest effectiveness of added damage of any projectile attack skill, clocking in at 250%. This means it scales incredibly well with support gems that provide flat added damage, such as added cold damage or ice bite. Flat added damage on our weapons or jewelry will also be quite powerful. Additionally, Spectral Helix has built-in pierce. This means that we do not need to spend skill points, gem slots, or currency on expensive gear in order to obtain pierce, fork, or chain. The skill also does not benefit from added projectiles, so we don't need things like greater multiple projectiles or an expensive dying sun. So between built-in pierce and no added projectiles, we can go full damage supports in our 6th link, instead of spending 2 or 3 skill gems on utility, like pierce, chain, or greater multiple projectiles. Next, Spectral Helix can hit enemies multiple times, as it is able to hit the same enemy once every 0.3 seconds. This means bosses with larger hitboxes, like Katava and Arakali, get absolutely destroyed by this build, as you can see in the background, since they are getting hit potentially up to 6 times per attack. Finally, Spectral Helix has incredible AoE, with the caveat that it almost feels like delayed damage, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, as most League starters, such as mines, traps, totems, and poison builds, are all delayed damage. But it can feel a little clunky and annoying for some players. As you can see here, when we throw out our Spectral Helix, it spirals out in that classic helix formation, which gives us nearly an entire screen worth of AoE over roughly 4 seconds. Alright, so we've established why Spectral Helix, but why Raider? Why not Deadeye? Why not Berserker or Assassin? Spectral Helix is a League starter. This means we are working with a very limited budget. My criteria for a League starter is that the build should be able to functionally run T16 Guardian maps on less than a 100C budget. And when I say 100 Chaos, I'm talking like day 1, day 2 League prices. The lower the budget, the better. Ideally, a starter build should function on a Tabula or a 5-link. Raider is a highly defensive ascendancy. It gets 40% spell suppression, 50% ailment avoidance, phasing, increased evasion, and movement speed. It also gains access to considerable damage with frenzy charge scaling and some of the strongest elemental exposure available. These perks make it very easy to reach permanent ailment immunity and 100% spell suppression without significant investment on the skill tree or in gear. All of this makes for an ideal League start situation, as it lowers the overall cost of the build. Another reason I have chosen Raider is that I will most likely want to transition to either Lightning Strike Raider or Tornado Shot Raider a few days into the League, after I have farmed up some currency, completed most of my Atlas objectives, and have reached at least level 90. By playing Raider from the very start, we save ourselves 40 Orbs of Regret, which we would have needed to spend if we had started something like Deadeye. And we save ourselves hours of leveling if we had started something like Assassin or Berserker. Also, transitioning from Spectral Helix to Lightning Strike is pretty simple, requiring only a few gem swaps and roughly 2 skill point changes on the tree outside of gear upgrades. So that is another thing to keep in mind for your League start. If you already have a second build in mind that you'd like to play after your League starter character, If there is a strong starter out there for the same class, it might be something worth looking into. Alright, let's dive into the gear and skills we are using for this build. I would like to preface this part of the video with the fact that this is a League Start build. That being said, the items showcased here are not endgame options, and were chosen for their early affordability. This is the kind of equipment you are likely to have at the start of yellow maps, and while the gear shown here will take you all the way through T16 Guardian maps, you will probably want to get some damage and defensive upgrades before trying to tackle other content like the Hidden or the Feared. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of the uniques featured in this build are T4 rarity, or the most common unique tier. So even if this build gains a lot of traction, the uniques are very unlikely to cost more than a few chaos. For our weapon, we are using a White Wind Dagger. This 1C unique is nearly 450 elemental DPS and gives us over 1000 flat evasion rating. Eventually you would probably want to buy or craft a very high elemental DPS Imperial Claw and run a Trinity setup instead. However, a good claw can go for dozens of exalts, whereas this dagger is literally only 1 chaos, and can potentially get you through the entire game. White Wind also gives us the option to forego a shield, as it gives us additional cold damage and spell suppression when our offhand is empty. I personally prefer to run a shield, as a shield gives us 3 additional gem slots, stats, block chance, and as well as up to 300 maximum life after multipliers. But in a pinch, going empty offhand is a viable option. Speaking of our shield, ideally you want life and spell suppression on an armor evasion base, but a pure evasion base works well too. Any additional stats after that is a bonus. For a helmet, we have a couple of options. We can run another 1 chaos unique, Starkandra's Head, which will give us quite a bit of damage and evasion, or we can run a rare evasion armor base with a deafening essence of loathing on it, which will allow us to run Defiance Banner at the cost of a little damage. Next up, we have our chest. Initially, you'll probably want to just pick up a tabula, but after that, getting a 6 link with life, spell suppression, and an open prefix for ailment avoidance would be pretty huge. Here we have our gloves. Initially, I would run Hrimsorrow, as they are another cheap 1 chaos unique. I would actually probably try and get one of these as early as possible, as they do add quite a bit of flat damage during the campaign. But endgame, you should try to transition to rare gloves with Eldritch Implicits. For our boots, we are running another 1C unique, 3-step Assault. These are pretty good early game for capping elemental avoidance. However, if you can get elemental avoidance on your chest or shield, you can drop these for Dark Rays, which are a pretty significant damage increase. Here we have our jewelry. Our belt is another 1 chaos unique, Belt of the Deceiver. This is an all-around good item which grants life, resistances, strength, and most importantly, intimidation. Again, this is another good item to pick up early on, as it is pretty powerful during the campaign. You can also drop this and start running a Stygian once you've got a Lethal Pride with Intimidation on it, or have Intimidation on your Eldritch Glove Implicits. For our amulet, we are just rocking an Onyx or a Gate amulet with life and resistances. Maximum mana and a damage stat like crit chance, crit multi, or flat damage would be pretty nice too. Since Omniscience is still alive and well in 3.18, that will probably be your end game amulet. However, it will require you to stack some attributes and also require you to get some additional accuracy on gear or on the tree, as it does convert dexterity to omniscience, and dexterity grants accuracy, while omniscience does not. For our rings, we are running whatever we can find with a lot of resistances, strength, intelligence, and life. If you can get a free prefix for a non-channeling craft, that would be awesome as well, but not strictly needed early on. Getting strength and intelligence on these rings is pretty helpful, since the build can be a little starved for them, as we do need 155 strength for our determination and molten shell, and 132 intelligence to wield our dagger. These attributes will also make transitioning to omniscience late game much easier. For our jewels, we're using anything with life. We can also use these to pick up any missing resistances or intelligence and strength. a damage stat like crit multi with one-handed weapons, increased damage with one-handed weapons, or increased attack speed with one-handed weapons would all be pretty good as well. Finally, we have our flasks. We are running a pretty standard life flask with bleed immunity, and charge on hit granite, jade, diamond, and silver flasks. We already have pretty decent movement speed with elusive effect, frenzy charge scaling, and whirling blades. But if you wanted even more speed, you could drop the jade flask for a quicksilver flask while mapping. Moving on to our skills, we've got our 6-link Spectral Helix. Inspiration and Nightblade are pretty mandatory. After that, you can run Ice Bite or added cold damage. And your final 2 gem skills are a bit optional. On a low budget, I run increased critical strike support. It's not technically the highest damage skill, but it allows you to basically reach 100% crit chance without any fancy gear, which is really nice for consistency of freezing enemies and one-shotting trash. One more thing to note here. Do not run Nightblade support super early on, until you've got a high enough crit chance between your tree, gear, and skills, as Nightblade doesn't do anything if you're not critting consistently. Here we have our movement skills, Flame Dash for moving over ledges, and Whirling Blades or Shield Charge for general mobility. I keep Flame Dash at level 10 for lower costs and a lower intelligence requirement. Next up, we've got Defiance Banner. It's pretty powerful, but you can go ahead and drop this if you've decided to run Stark Hanja early on, as you won't have enough mana reservation without an Essence Crafted Helmet, Eldritch Helmet, or an expensive Amulet Anointment. Here we have Molten Shell. I usually like to run my Molten Shell on left click, basically giving you a 50% chance for it to be up before you get hit. However, since we are running Withering Step on left click to lazily reset our elusive effect, we need to put Molten Shell on cast when damage taken. I keep Molten Shell at level 10 and cast when damage taken at 1, so that it will proc often. But you can play around with it and see what works best for you. Another option is to put Molten Shell on left click and strategically cast Withering Step to reset Nightblade elusive effect only when it gets low. But that's a lot of work. Withering Step I keep at level 10, again for a lower cost, as it doesn't really matter what level it is, since it is just getting used as a reset button for elusive. For our main auras, we are running Determination, Hatred, Herald of Ice, and Precision. Determination gives us a lot of armor, which helps us with slams and increases our Molten Shell buff. Hatred gives us some fat cold damage, and synergizes well with White Wind and Hrimsorrow. Herald of Ice is here for more flat added cold damage and some juicy explosions. And Precision is there for crit chance and accuracy. If you want it to be a little tankier, you could run Grace instead of Hatred. I wouldn't really recommend it though, as it's a pretty big damage loss. And Grace always feels like fake tankiness to me on builds that already have high evasion chance, since it doesn't reduce the damage of hits you take, just the frequency at which you take them. Next we have our Creeping Frost Bone Chill setup. Bone Chill causes enemies which are chilled to take increased cold damage. We put this in a 4-link with increased duration and GMP so that we can get a little more damage on bosses. If you end up switching over to a Trinity Claw setup, you should drop Creeping Frost, as it only buffs cold damage output. Here we have our Ancestral Protector, which gives us increased attack speed while we are within half a screen from it. Place it down before boss fights for a little boost of DPS. If you end up having a free link, I'd recommend putting life gained on hit with this, as it's not particularly tanky without the life leech from claws. Finally, we have our Assassin's Mark on hit link. I've gone ahead and tied it to life tap, as the trigger cost is pretty expensive and may not always cast if you're low on mana. Another viable option would be to drop both Mark on hit and life tap and simply manually cast Assassin's Mark on bosses only, since it is a permanent debuff now. Alright, moving on, we have our skill tree. I've tried my best to put in leveling trees as well, so you can click through here and see, oh, I'm at Act 2. What should my skill tree look like? Keep in mind, we take a few nodes in the leveling tree that we spec out of later. For example, we take Ballistics early on, as we need to path through it, but we spec out of it later in the endgame tree. It seems like a great node on paper, But added projectile speed, unfortunately, makes us deal less damage on bosses. Since our Spectral Helix spends less time inside an enemy's hitbox, it won't have enough time to proc twice per hit. And there you have it, my League Start Spectral Helix Raider, an incredibly cheap and efficient starter build that can be scaled all the way into the endgame, or used as a springboard into another build like Lightning Strike or Tornado Shot. I'll go ahead and close out the video with a quick Forge of the Phoenix run, so you can really see its capabilities on the gear equivalent to that shown in the League Start budget POB. But if you've enjoyed this video so far, please hit that thumbs up button, and consider subscribing to the channel, as it does help out a lot. Anyway, thank you for watching, good luck with your League, and I'll see you in the next one.